It took a millennium to create the European miracle, and a single month to destroy it. June 1914. A teenage assassin fires 2 shots in a forgotten Balkan town. 4 years later, 20 million people are dead. 4 empires have collapsed, and the world will never be the same again. This is the story of how it happened. The First World War was, in George Kennan's words, the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. In 1914, Europe was the richest civilization in human history. Its influence touched every corner of the globe: culture, language, finance, military standards, political systems. That year, the continent celebrated nearly a century of peace and prosperity. Wars had happened, yes, but not those apocalyptic clashes between great powers that had defined Europe before 1815. Every generation was richer than the last, healthier, happier, better fed. Each year brought new marvels: the telephone, the motorcar, the aeroplane, electricity. The energy was young, ambitious, self-confident. Europe stood at the peak of human achievement. And then in 4 grueling years, it tore itself apart. Here's what makes this story so haunting. Almost nobody saw it coming. Without one assassination, 1914 would have passed peacefully. If there was to be a war that summer, experts predicted something small, maybe Greece versus the Ottoman Empire on Europe's southern edge. Not a continent-wide catastrophe involving millions of men. So why did 2 pistol shots in a remote Balkan town end the long peace? The answer is not simple. To understand August 1914, we have to go back 40 years. We have to watch Germany transform from 5 squabbling states into one unified empire. We have to meet the man who made it happen, a half-mad Prussian genius named Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was always a wild card. Tall, physically imposing, he ate and drank on a gargantuan scale. Disraeli told Queen Victoria he looked like an ogre. But his voice was thin and reedy, his hands delicate. Appallingly cynical and utterly ruthless, yet also witty, charming, capable of weeping in public. He inspired devotion even from enemies. No one in Europe could quite get the measure of him. Within 10 years, Bismarck would take Prussia from weakest to strongest power in Europe. He would forge Germany through 3 brutal wars. He would build the most intricate diplomatic system the continent had ever seen, a web of alliances designed to keep the peace. And when he fell from power in 1890, that system began to unravel. We'll watch a new German Kaiser, young, erratic, desperate to prove himself, tear apart everything Bismarck built. We'll see France and Russia form an alliance that terrifies Berlin. We'll witness Britain abandon a century of neutrality. We'll follow empires as they collide over Morocco, over the Balkans, over naval supremacy in the North Sea. Crisis after crisis. Each time Europe pulls back from the brink. Each time the tension ratchets higher. Until Sarajevo. June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visits Bosnia with his wife Sophie. It's a Serbian national holiday, an insensitive choice. A terrorist cell called the Black Hand has sent 6 young assassins armed with bombs and pistols. The first attempt fails. A bomb bounces off the Archduke's car. On the way back, the driver takes a wrong turn. The car stops to reverse. Directly in front of 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip. 2 shots. Sophie dies first. Franz Ferdinand bleeds out minutes later, whispering, "It's nothing, it's nothing." In Vienna, the Austrian government sees an opportunity to crush Serbia once and for all. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm gives Austria a blank check, full support, whatever happens. In St. Petersburg, Russia warns it won't abandon its Serbian allies. In Paris, France is bound by treaty to support Russia. In London, Britain watches nervously. 4 weeks. That's how long it takes. 4 weeks of ultimatums, mobilizations, and catastrophic miscalculations. By August 4th, Europe is at war. The soldiers march off, singing, flowers in their rifles. Everyone thinks it'll be over by Christmas. They're wrong. It will last 4 years. It will kill 20 million people. It will destroy 4 empires and shatter European civilization. And when it finally ends in November 1918, the world will still be living with the consequences. This is the story of how one assassination triggered a continental suicide. This is the story of alliances and arms races, of pride and miscalculation, of men who saw catastrophe coming but couldn't stop it. This is how World War I began. 1870. Germany doesn't exist. Instead, 5 separate states squabble over territory, trade, and prestige. The largest is Prussia, militaristic, efficient, but weak by European standards. 1871. One unified German empire. The transformation is almost solely down to one man, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck's rise was unlikely. He'd been raised as a middling Prussian junker, one of the landed aristocrats who dominated the kingdom's politics. Smart, yes, but wild. Unpredictable. The kind of man the Berlin elite kept at arm's length. He was shuttled from one diplomatic posting to another, seemingly destined for nothing more than a comfortable ambassadorship in Paris. Then, in 1862, everything changed. Prussia faced a constitutional crisis. King Wilhelm I wanted to expand the army. Specifically, he wanted conscripts to serve 3 years instead of 2. The problem was money, and the Landtag, Prussia's parliament, controlled by liberals opposed to royal power, refused to give him a single Pfennig. The king was desperate. He turned to the one man crazy enough to solve the problem, Bismarck. Bismarck's solution was brilliantly simple and completely illegal. A loophole in Prussia's constitution allowed the government to collect the previous year's taxes without parliamentary consent. So that's what he did. The army reform went ahead. The liberals were furious. The king seemed ready to sacrifice Bismarck to save his own skin. But the new minister-president had a bigger plan. For decades, there had been talk of German nationalism, the idea that all German-speaking peoples should unite into a single country. In 1848, revolutionaries had tried to make it happen through democracy and popular uprising. They failed spectacularly. The monarchs, who actually ruled the German states, wanted nothing to do with it. And the monarchs controlled the armies. Bismarck's idea was different. Why not unify Germany with the Prussian army? In September 1862, he went before the Landtag and laid out his vision. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided, he told them. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849. He paused. But by iron and blood. The liberals were horrified. The money they hadn't granted was going to be used for wars they didn't want. But Bismarck meant what he said, and he was about to prove it. 3 wars in 7 years. Each one perfectly calculated. Each one brutally executed. First, Denmark. In 1864, the Danish king tried to annex the Duchy of Schleswig, a German-speaking territory he technically ruled, but that was claimed by a German prince. The Schleswig-Holstein question was so complicated that the British Prime Minister later joked only 3 people had ever understood it. One was dead, one had gone mad, and he himself had forgotten it. Bismarck didn't care about the details. He used the dispute as a pretext for war. In a quick campaign, Prussia and Austria together recovered both Schleswig and Holstein for the German Confederation. Then Bismarck turned on Austria itself. The Habsburg emperors in Vienna had been Germany's overlords for nearly 500 years. In 1866, it took the newly reformed Prussian army 7 weeks to bring them to their knees. The Battle of Königgrätz was decisive, 50,000 Austrian casualties in a single day. In the aftermath, Bismarck dissolved the German Confederation and forced every principality north of the River Main into a Prussian-led union. He annexed them in all but name. Back home, the liberal bloc that had prayed daily for Bismarck's fall now joined the victory celebrations. Soon after, they agreed to a compromise. They would backdate the army reforms, and Bismarck promised never to bypass them again. "I've beaten them all," Bismarck declared, hammering his fist on the desk. But the job wasn't finished. The southern German kingdoms remained independent. Too big to be coerced like Saxony. Too small to be left alone like Austria. Too German to be omitted from any unification. Too Catholic to willingly join with the Protestant North. Bismarck needed an outside threat. Something that would make the southern Germans look to Berlin for protection. In France, he found one. The trigger was the Spanish throne. When Spain looked for a new king, Prussia suggested a Hohenzollern relative, someone from the same dynasty that ruled Prussia. Paris was alarmed. A Hohenzollern in Spain would mean German influence on both France's eastern and southern borders. The French ambassador demanded that King Wilhelm retract the proposal. Wilhelm actually agreed. The crisis should have ended there. But Bismarck had other plans. He edited the telegram reporting the king's reply to make it seem as if Wilhelm had insulted the French ambassador. The doctored message, known as the Ems telegram, was released to the press. In Paris, crowds demanded war. In Berlin, crowds demanded war. Bismarck had his war. The French were catastrophically unprepared. Their army was smaller, poorly organized, and equipped with inferior rifles. Within a month, the Prussians surrounded and destroyed France's main army at Sedan. Emperor Napoleon III himself was captured. Believing France to be the aggressor, the southern German states rallied to Prussia's side. Glory proved a powerful intoxicant. In January 1871, all the German princes gathered in the most symbolic location imaginable, the Palace of Versailles, the heart of French power. There, in Louis XIV's Hall of Mirrors, they proclaimed Wilhelm as Kaiser, Emperor of a unified German Empire. Paris held out for 4 more months in a desperate siege. The city starved. People ate rats, then cats, then the animals from the zoo. Finally, the provisional French government sued for peace. The Treaty of Frankfurt was harsh. France would pay a 5 billion franc indemnity, an astronomical sum. Until it was paid, German troops would occupy much of northern France. Most humiliatingly, though, Germany seized the border provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. These territories had large German-speaking populations and, Bismarck argued, were necessary for the new nation to have militarily defensible frontiers. For France, still drunk on memories of Napoleon Bonaparte's glory, the loss was unbearable. It was as if a limb had been amputated. In Paris, the statue representing Strasbourg, capital of Alsace, was draped in black. Student textbooks would describe the Treaty of Frankfurt as a truce, not a peace. The wound would never heal. Bismarck had proved himself more worthy of Frederick the Great's legacy than any Hohenzollern king in a century. Prussia had gone from last to first among Europe's powers. The once squabbling German states were now forged into a formidable empire. It was Nietzsche's will to power embodied in one man's actions. But triumph inevitably created the conditions for the fall. Since Louis XIV 200 years earlier, France had been the continent's most powerful country. For the older generation, Napoleon and his conquests were within living memory. To now have that position usurped was a devastating geopolitical earthquake. France would not take it lightly. In Britain's House of Commons, the future Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, rose to speak. The new German Empire, he announced, was a German revolution, a greater political event than the French Revolution of the last century. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The balance of power has been entirely destroyed. Bismarck was no fool. He understood that such a powerful new country would be seen as a threat by the four other great powers of Europe. And so, now elevated to the position of Chancellor, he set out to make peace rather than war. The diplomatic system Bismarck created rested on a simple assumption: France, resentful at its lost power and provinces, would always be hostile to Germany. Germany alone could beat France in a straight fight. The Reich had a larger army, a stronger economy, and better organization. But if France found allies, if it could forge partnerships with Austria or Russia or Britain, that was a different question entirely. The solution was obvious: block that possibility. Isolate France completely. Make Germany indispensable to everyone else. All politics reduce themselves to this formula, Bismarck liked to say. Try to be à trois in a world governed by 5 powers. 3 against 2. Those were the odds Bismarck wanted. In 1873, he achieved it. The Three Emperors League brought together Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, 3 empires, ruled by monarchs who shared a common interest in maintaining the European status quo against Republican France. It wasn't a real alliance. There was no commitment to go to war on behalf of another member. But for Germany, it meant France remained friendless. And that was enough. Bismarck had been cultivating these relationships from the very beginning. Back in 1863, he'd supported the Tsar's ruthless suppression of a rebellion in Russian-owned Poland. In 1871, he'd given his blessing when St. Petersburg renounced the Black Sea clauses, limits placed on the Russian Navy after the Crimean War 15 years earlier. Austria should have been more complicated. After all, Prussia had just fought her for control of Germany. But following the decisive Prussian victory at Königgrätz, Bismarck had argued bitterly against taking any Austrian territory. He even threatened to resign when King Wilhelm wanted to march on Vienna itself. The leniency of the settlement allowed for quick reconciliation. Vienna could accept defeat because it wasn't total humiliation. Within a few years, Austria and Prussia were partners. For nearly a decade, the system worked. France remained isolated. Europe remained at peace. But cracks were already appearing. The problem was France itself. The beaten nation surprised everyone by the speed of its recovery. The massive 5 billion franc indemnity was paid off in just 3 years, so rapidly it contributed to an economic crisis throughout the Western world. The shattered military was completely rebuilt through sweeping reforms. Meanwhile, French politics became intensely focused on one thing: reclaiming the lost provinces. In 1875, a German newspaper close to the government published an editorial with an ominous title, "Is War in Sight?" Throughout Europe, this was taken as evidence that Bismarck was testing the waters, sounding out whether Germany should launch a preventive war to stop France's recovery. Both Britain and Russia warned Berlin they would not allow another aggressive war. The crisis went nowhere. The leak probably didn't even come from Bismarck. But it revealed something crucial. Germany was still seen as a threat, even by its own supposed allies. The real challenge to Bismarck's system, though, wasn't France. It was his allies. Austria and Russia were not on good terms with each other. Both empires competed for influence in the Balkan Peninsula, that volatile region where the Ottoman Empire's slow collapse created constant instability. In 1877, the tensions exploded. Russia went to war with the Ottoman Empire, ostensibly to protect the large Christian population facing abuse under Turkish rule. This was part of what diplomats called the Eastern Question, the debate over what to do with the Ottoman Empire, widely referred to as the sick man of Europe. The Russians hoped for Turkey's destruction and expected to profit territorially. After a brutal slog to the gates of Constantinople, costing immense casualties, they forced the Ottomans to sign a preliminary peace treaty. The agreement completely reordered the Balkans, creating a large new Bulgarian state that would inevitably become a Russian puppet. Austria and Britain were horrified. Such disintegration of Turkish power, such growth of Russian influence, both threatened to upend the entire balance in southeastern Europe. Vienna and London threatened war if the treaty stood. Bismarck faced disaster. His carefully constructed Three Emperors League was on the verge of collapse. Worse, Europe was closer to a general war than at any time since 1815. His solution was to position himself as an honest broker. He offered to host a Congress of European powers in Berlin to settle the matter peacefully. The result was a new treaty that substantially reduced Russian gains and saved the Ottoman Empire from immediate collapse. Several new Balkan states were created, but Russia's ambitions were checked, is less than #, 5#, is greater than, the Three Emperors League was effectively shattered. Bismarck was terrified by how close Europe had come to war in 1878. The breakdown in communication between the Habsburg and Romanov empires showed him the fragility of his system. Previously, he'd viewed peace mainly as a way to secure Germany's power and prestige. From 1879 onwards, his position became more conservative. He was now determined to secure a general peace for the continent's sake, not just Germany's alone. As the historian A.J.P. Taylor put it, it was the moment when Germany accepted the full responsibilities of a great power. The new system was more complex than the old. In 1879, Bismarck signed a formal alliance with Austria-Hungary, the Dual Alliance. This time, there were real commitments. Germany would go to war on Austria's behalf if she were attacked by Russia. Kaiser Wilhelm I objected. Why provoke Russia, he asked, when the Tsar was neither threatening nor hostile to Germany? It was a valid point. 25 years earlier, Bismarck himself had complained about tying the trim Prussian frigate to the worm-eaten Austrian galleon. The disparity remained the same in 1879, perhaps even more visible. But Bismarck had his reasons. The treaty, he argued, would give Germany a say over Austrian policy. It would prevent Vienna from seeking an alliance with France or Britain. Most importantly, it would restrain Austria's more aggressive tendencies in the Balkans. In the short term, it worked. In the long term, as events would prove, it was an assessment that would take both empires to their doom. Wilhelm worried the Austrian treaty would permanently alienate his nephew, the Russian emperor. But St. Petersburg, broke and vulnerable after the costly Turkish war, still needed good relations with Germany. After careful diplomatic maneuvering, Bismarck badgered the Russians into signing up for a new Three Emperors League in 1881. Like before, it wasn't a formal alliance. It didn't cancel out the Austro-German treaty. What it did do was promise neutrality if one power was attacked by an outside party. If Bismarck's perpetual fear of a Franco-German war came true, Vienna and St. Petersburg wouldn't stab Berlin in the back. Russia and Austria also agreed to take account of each other's interests in the Balkan Peninsula. For the next quarter century, cooperation, self-restraint, and informal spheres of influence would generally keep this tinderbox relatively quiet. For Bismarck, it meant he'd avoided the possibility of a two-front war and brought the opposing forces of Habsburg and Romanov together again. Peace on the continent seemed assured. The following year, Italy joined the Austro-German Pact, turning it into the Triple Alliance. Like Germany, Italy was a recently unified nation. This treaty was yet another step in the isolation of France. Paris was now totally quarantined. Step back and look at what Bismarck had created, an intricate web of overlapping secret agreements, treaties, and deals. The key thing to emphasize is that all of them had a single point of failure: Otto von Bismarck himself. He was the one keeping this convoluted system together. For all his genius, problems still abounded. The Balkans remained the most persistent thorn. In 1885, a crisis over Bulgarian unification finally killed the Second Three Emperors League. The end of the League didn't necessarily mean a new era of Austria-Russian rivalry. Indeed, the Balkan question remained relatively static for more than 20 years. But the omens were not good. Bismarck's solution was to hedge his bets. The Triple Alliance with Austria and Italy would be maintained. But Russia would get a new agreement exclusively with Germany, the Reinsurance Treaty. It wasn't a full alliance. The terms meant Russia would remain neutral in a French war, and Germany would remain neutral in an Austro-Russian war where Vienna was the aggressor. But Bismarck was playing a dangerous game now. The Austrian and Russian agreements were bilateral. They contained secret and contradictory promises from Germany to each empire. Only a select group in Berlin and St. Petersburg even knew of the Reinsurance Treaty's existence. If its terms were ever made public, Bismarck would be exposed as a cheat to the Austrians. His entire diplomatic web would crumble. Germany hadn't lost its European influence. But the diplomatic dance Bismarck had to perform to maintain it master ballerina that he was getting more complex by the month. In 1888, Bismarck had governed Prussia, then Germany, for more than a quarter century. He could do so only because of the constant loyalty and commitment shown by Kaiser Wilhelm I. The old monarch still balked at many of Bismarck's policies. He questioned the convoluted agreements and treaties that seemed to have little respect for honor or chivalry. But he knew he was dependent on his chancellor. Generally, he allowed Bismarck free rein. That year, at the astonishing age of 90, Wilhelm finally died. Everything was about to change. March 1888. Kaiser Wilhelm I dies at the age of 90. His son and heir, Crown Prince Frederick, is 58 years old. In stark contrast to his conservative, autocratic father, Frederick is an outspoken political liberal. Frederick's wife is Victoria, known as Vicky, the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria of England. Intelligent, articulate, strong-willed, she'd been raised by her parents with a specific mission: to transform Prussia into a liberal, constitutional monarchy modelled on Britain. If successful, she would help create a unified Germany, partnered with Great Britain, leading Europe into a new age of progress and enlightenment. It was a beautiful dream, and it died in 99 days. Frederick had been diagnosed with throat cancer a year earlier. A heavy smoker his entire life, he was already seriously ill when he inherited the throne. His reign lasted just over 3 months. On June 15, 1888, he died. Frederick III is often considered one of the great what-ifs of 19th century history. What if he'd lived longer? What if Vicky had been given time to implement her reforms? The reality, though, is that the liberal bloc that had once dominated the Prussian parliament had long since been broken by Bismarck. What Frederick and Vicky could have realistically changed against opposition from the army, the aristocracy, and the Iron Chancellor himself remains unclear. What's certain is that what came next was very different. The third emperor of 1888 was Frederick and Vicky's eldest son, Wilhelm II. Just 29 years old, he was immediately recognizable. Handsome face, constant theatricality, pointed mustache that his barber stuck up with wax every morning. Photos usually show him carefully positioned to hide his left arm, which suffered from a deformity caused by a traumatic birth. The disability made his hand practically useless, a source of deep distress for both him and his mother. As a boy, Wilhelm felt suffocated by Vicky's rigorous educational regime designed to mould him into an English-style liberal. He felt starved of affection, constantly measured against an impossible ideal. In rebellion, he turned to the traditional conservative and militarist values of Prussia. When he was posted to an elite guards regiment as a young man, he announced, "I have finally found my home." Bismarck had watched all this with pleasure. He didn't expect Wilhelm to take the throne in his lifetime, but a conservative son could be useful as a counterweight to the liberal father. To cultivate the relationship, he'd arranged for Wilhelm to gain experience in the Foreign Office and even allowed him to read confidential state documents, privileges never afforded to Frederick. Now Wilhelm was emperor of the most powerful country in Europe, and Bismarck was about to discover he'd created a monster. From the beginning, Wilhelm made clear his intention to eventually break with Bismarck once he'd learned the ropes of government. He disliked the Chancellor's almost dictatorial control over Germany. Bismarck ruled mainly from his country estate, miles outside Berlin, too far for Wilhelm to easily question him. With Bismarck as Chancellor, how could the Kaiser ever exercise his own will for Germany? The focus for Wilhelm's complaints quickly became foreign policy. Bismarck's role as honest broker had made him personally very important in the European system. He settled territorial squabbles, encouraged other empires' overseas expansion, tried at all costs to preserve European peace. But what exactly did this do for Germany? Why should Berlin always play the disinterested benevolent power while other states carved up the map? Bismarck had reluctantly picked up a few colonies in Africa and the Pacific to satisfy public demand. But as Britain and France gobbled up the rest of Africa, as Russia expanded in Asia and Austria in the Balkans, Germany's territorial ambitions seemed distinctly lacking. Bismarck's response was that Germany was a satiated power. The cast actions. Her borders were relatively defensible. In time, the immense economic potential of the Reich would increase her strength organically. Getting involved in territorial squabbles and risking war was the only real way this could be upset. For Wilhelm, such pacifism would not do. Germany, by 1890, had the most powerful economy on the continent. It had overtaken even Britain in several traditional industries. Germany seemed primed to dominate Europe, seize its own colonial empire, become the world's foremost power. At least, that's what the more radical parts of the Prussian military believed. Bismarckian restraint would no longer suffice. The power struggle between Kaiser and Chancellor came to a head in 1890. The trigger was anti-socialist laws. When these came up for renewal, Bismarck insisted they be extended and strengthened, giving the police extensive powers to remove agitators from their homes. The coalition of conservatives and liberals that made up Bismarck's support in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, split over implementing such autocratic measures. Wilhelm intervened, supporting a suggestion to renew the laws without the home expulsion clause. Bismarck would have none of it. Instead, he openly tried to subvert the Kaiser by getting the entire set of laws vetoed. When confronted, he announced his true aim: precipitate a crisis with the socialists, then use it as an excuse to crush them with the army. This was as close to insanity as Bismarck ever came. Wilhelm, understandably, did not want to start his reign with a civil war. The farce meant Bismarck's majority in the Reichstag collapsed. The Chancellor was unable to form another coalition. "I have come from the political deathbed of a great man," said a former rival after a meeting with Bismarck. Everyone knew it was the end. Bismarck wrote Wilhelm a scathing resignation letter. The Kaiser quietly accepted it. The public was told the founder of the German Empire had retired due to ill health. His reward was the title Duke of Lauenburg. Useful, Bismarck quipped, only when I want to travel incognito. The Iron Chancellor retired to his estates, vengefully bitter toward Wilhelm. Before he left, he made a prophecy. Jena came 20 years after the death of Frederick the Great, he said, referring to Prussia's catastrophic defeat by Napoleon in 1806. The crash will come 20 years after my departure, if things go on like this. He died in 1898. 20 years later, Wilhelm fled across the Dutch border into exile as the German Empire collapsed around him. The prophecy was fulfilled. The Kaiser now had full control over German policy. His replacement for the Iron Chancellor was Leo von Caprivi, a 59-year-old career military officer. The model of a competent, efficient, stoic Prussian. Devoted to his work, he would normally have been a good choice. But Caprivi had been given a near impossible task. Both the German constitution and the country's place in the European system had been engineered to revolve almost entirely around Bismarck. With his sudden dismissal, Caprivi was left to pick up the pieces while Wilhelm bounced from one idea to another. "I know I shall be covered with mud," the new chancellor muttered, "that I shall fall ingloriously." The most pressing issue facing Germany in 1890 was whether to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. Until his appointment, Caprivi, like almost everybody else, had no knowledge of this secret pact. Within a week of taking office, he had to decide if it should be continued. Wilhelm, characteristically, had already confused matters by giving the delighted Russian ambassador his personal guarantee that the treaty would be renewed. But Caprivi, with very little understanding of foreign affairs, was convinced by a key official in the Foreign Office, Friedrich von Holstein, to let the agreement lapse. Holstein's argument was simple. The reinsurance treaty needlessly complicated relations with Austria, who didn't know of its existence and might cancel their own alliance with Germany if they found out. Besides, the alliance with Russia was blocking better relations with Britain, whom St. Petersburg competed with in Central Asia. Persuaded, Caprivi decided against renewal in favor of what he called a simple and transparent foreign policy. The Russians were dumbfounded. Their ambassador had been given Wilhelm's personal promise just days earlier. Now Russia found itself without an alliance, staring at a potentially hostile bloc of Germany, Austria, and Italy right next door. It was a strategic catastrophe from which they had to escape. And there was only one obvious way to do so. On July 23rd, only 4 months after Germany's refusal to renew the reinsurance treaty, a French naval flotilla paid a visit to the Russian naval base at Kronstadt, just outside St. Petersburg. The Tsar gave a reception for its commander. Something remarkable happened. When the French national anthem began to play, Tsar Alexander III stood to attention. The Marseillaise, that revolutionary hymn banned in Russia for its republican associations, was now being honoured by the autocrat himself. Bismarck's nightmare was coming true. Over the next 3 years, France and Russia moved closer together. In 1891, their foreign ministers agreed informally that in case of war, the two nations would offer a joint response. More detailed arrangements were made the following year, including a mutual defence pact against Germany. By 1894, the alliance had been formalised with full military commitments. For Paris, this was practically manna from heaven. For nearly 20 years, France had been shut out from the European diplomatic system by Bismarck's genius. Now France had power on the European stage again. Germany would have to maintain a sizable army on the French border whether Paris was in a conflict or not. Most importantly, France was no longer alone. But the Franco-Russian alliance created a problem that would haunt Europe for the next 2 decades. Germany now faced the possibility of a two-front war. In the east, millions of Russian soldiers. In the west, the revived and vengeful French army. The lack of coordination between Wilhelm and Caprivi over the reinsurance treaty wasn't an aberration. During Caprivi's 4.5 years in power, he offered or threatened to resign 10 times, wearied by dealing with the Kaiser's schizophrenic policies. One day, an army captain randomly appeared at Caprivi's office and announced he was the newly appointed governor of German Cameroon. Caprivi assumed the man was deranged and tried to send him away. It turned out Wilhelm had given him the job off the cuff after meeting him at a reception. The Kaiser gave way when questioned, but these constant occurrences exhausted Caprivi. In October 1894, his resignation was finally accepted. "The Kaiser is like a balloon," Bismarck had once said of Wilhelm. "If you don't keep fast hold of the string, you never know where he will be off to." Having gotten a taste for power, Wilhelm desired a chancellor who would be merely a vessel for his concept of personal rule, allowing him to govern Germany as he saw fit. "I shall take a younger man," the Kaiser declared. On October 29th, he appointed Prince Hohenlohe, age 75. Hohenlohe was an old and experienced statesman, but by this point he was physically decrepit. He did his best to avoid the job, knowing he didn't have the strength or stamina for it. This suited Wilhelm perfectly. He thought a barely sentient chancellor would be less inclined to block his meddling. Hohenlohe tried to moderate the Kaiser's tendencies, like a tiring grandfather dealing with an obstinate child. It was to no avail. By 1897, he had effectively given up. His successor's assessment, almost 80 years old, tired, ill, totally indolent, and completely passive. The unrestrained freedom brought out the worst in Wilhelm. While the German machinery of government remained efficient and largely able to carry out daily tasks seamlessly, the ship was effectively rudderless. The Kaiser bounced from one idea to another, suggesting grandiose schemes at breakfast, only to drop them by dinner. Wilhelm had his grip on Germany. But Germany's grip on European politics was rapidly slipping away. In 1900, the eyes of the world turned to Paris as it hosted the greatest display of European wealth in 50 years. The Exposition Universelle showed off a century of technological, scientific, and social progress. Elaborate pavilions were set up by each nation, displaying their innovations and culture. For the Western world, it was a celebration of power and dominance. But for France, it was also compensation. Under the gaze of the new Eiffel Tower, built just over a decade earlier, stalls around the city displayed parts of France's colonial empire. To outsiders, it was a triumph. But you couldn't shake the feeling that France was making up for something. 30 years earlier, the country had been left broken and defeated by the victorious Prussian army. Louis XIV's majestic Hall of Mirrors, once an outlandish representation of French power, had played host to the ceremony, proclaiming a new German empire. The change in France's international position couldn't be overstated. For centuries, France had been the preeminent force on the continent. Now it faced a united empire with a larger economy, military, and population. Nonetheless, the French resolved to overcome their humiliation. In just 3 years, the enormous 5 billion franc indemnity was paid off. The army was put through revolutionary reforms. Universal free education was introduced throughout the country. Schoolboys were taught of the lost provinces and their coming return to France from the very start. Everything pointed to unity of purpose. Everything except the government. In the aftermath of the war, France had become a republic. Nobody expected it to last. A republic meant factionalism, and factionalism meant infighting while the Prussian wolf remained at the door. In the 1873 elections, the monarchists won a majority. The exiled Bourbon pretender was invited to take his crown. But he refused. He would not accept the revolutionary tricolour as the national flag. The French people would not accept him without it. His ancestor had declared that Paris was worth a mass. Worth a rag, though, it apparently was not. Thus the Republic remained. The system which divides us the least, the first president, Thiers, said. An island of meritocracy in a sea of monarchies. The isolation was exaggerated by Bismarck's machinations, keeping Austria and Russia out of reach. Italy squabbled with France over African territories. Only Britain was friendly throughout the 1870s, though she would never consider a formal alliance. Then in 1881, the British occupied Egypt, always within France's sphere of influence. The insult was too much. Britain was added to the growing list under Marianne's curse. National isolation meant there was no possibility of revising the settlement of 1871, but the loss of Alsace-Lorraine could never be forgotten. In Paris, the statue representing Strasbourg, capital of Alsace, was draped in black. Student textbooks described the Treaty of Frankfurt as a truce, not a peace. Nationalist politicians clamoured for revanche, revenge. On the whole, though, the French understood that for now the territory was lost. After the 1870s, much of the initial nationalist fervour, if never extinguished, at least settled down. Neither war nor renunciation, the future socialist leader Jean Jaurès announced. France instead looked to recoup prestige abroad, particularly by expanding its colonial empire in Africa and the Far East. Foreign investment in new markets, like the Ottoman Empire, began to flow. All of these moves were encouraged by Bismarck, watching eagle-eyed from Berlin and hoping to direct French energies elsewhere. For nearly 2 decades, it worked. Paris sought to expand overseas. At times, quarrels with Germany almost seemed forgotten. But old tensions could never be truly settled. In the late 1880s, they came close to boiling point with the emergence of General Boulanger. Handsome and popular, he campaigned on a platform of 3 R's: revanche, revision, and restoration. The phrase gained nationwide support. All of Europe braced for a new Napoleon, determined to redress France's place in the world with military force. But Boulanger was no Napoleon. He was more idea than man, capable of rousing people, but not of leading them. Just when an overthrow of the Republic seemed inevitable, the general lost his nerve and fled to Belgium. A few months later, he shot himself. Boulangerism as a movement disappeared almost in a puff of smoke. But the ideas it represented, dissatisfaction with the Republic, extreme nationalism, and most of all, revanche, could never be exercised. Still, what could France do? At the beginning of 1890, Bismarck remained in power. Neither Russia nor Austria would countenance breaking with Germany. France, it seemed, was destined to remain isolated and spurned. But that was about to change. On June 22, 1897, London, imperial capital of the world and heart of the British Empire, was brought to a standstill. Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom, Empress of India, Defender of the Faith, celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. Soldiers from an empire encompassing nearly a quarter of the globe took part in military parades. At Spithead, the Prince of Wales reviewed the largest naval fleet in the world, rows and rows of warships lined up as far as the eye could see. Empire was the word of the day. Unlike the celebrations for the Queen's Golden Jubilee a decade earlier, which had involved large contingents from European nations, 1897 was to be an imperial holiday. The colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, intended the festivities to double as a display of British power to the world. The world was impressed. The French newspaper Le Figaro announced that Rome itself had been surpassed. The New York Times crowed that America was a part, and a great part, of the Greater Britain, which seems so plainly destined to dominate this planet. Even the press in Berlin described the empire as practically unassailable. Only a few voices voiced tenuous doubts. "Far called our navies melt away," Rudyard Kipling wrote in a poem composed for the Jubilee. "Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre." In 1897, though, a challenge to British power seemed almost unthinkable. The 19th century had been Britain's century. Following Napoleon's defeat, her empire had expanded rapidly. Her economy had surpassed all others. Her navy dwarfed its competitors. The notion that Britain had been given a divinely ordained mission to make the world English was commonly held. Her civilization, so many thought, had proved itself manifestly superior to all others. Yet nagging doubts remained. The Prime Minister was the third Marquess of Salisbury. Tall, fat, and rich, superficially, he looked every bit the self-assured British aristocrat. In fact, Salisbury was shy, neurotic, and depressive. He also had the best grasp of foreign policy of any premier in history. But these factors combined to make him deeply pessimistic about the future. "Whatever happens will be for the worse," was his motto, and therefore it is in our interest that as little should happen as possible. Like Kipling, Salisbury was wary that the only direction for a nation at the top was down. 2 years later, the empire was at war. In South Africa, the British-owned Cape Colony existed uneasily alongside two Boer republics, inhabited by descendants of earlier Dutch settlers. The discovery of huge gold deposits in the late 1880s breathed new life into the impoverished states is less than Hashem. Zero hash is greater than. This windfall funded the ambitions of Transvaal's President Kruger, allowing him to dream of breaking free from British influence. Gold brought new challenges. Thousands of prospectors were drawn by fortune's lure, a large percentage British. They were onerously taxed to fund Kruger's schemes and afforded few political rights. Many petitioned the British government for aid. The Prime Minister of the Cape Colony was Cecil Rhodes, a ruthless diamond magnate and devoted British imperialist. He sensed an opportunity. If the British settlers could be persuaded to revolt, the Boer republics would be overthrown from inside and British rule established throughout South Africa. In 1895, he arranged for his colleague, Leander Jameson, to stage a raid into Transvaal with the aim of stirring up such a rising. The operation was an unmitigated disaster. The settlers failed to rise. Jameson was quickly captured. Throughout Europe, there was outrage at what looked like an unprovoked invasion. Tensions escalated for 4 years. In 1899, when it looked as if Prussia might place a Hohenzollern relative on the Spanish throne, the situation finally exploded. The Boers issued an ultimatum. Britain refused. The Boers invaded. Although the Boers initially outnumbered their enemy and quickly laid siege to 3 fortified towns, everyone in London expected a swift victory once relief forces were dispatched. But the Boers were experienced horsemen and riflemen. Badly led British attacks were easily beaten back. In December, they suffered a string of defeats in quick succession in an event dubbed Black Week. Instead of 3 months, the war took 3 years, 450,000 soldiers, and £210 million. "We have received no end of a lesson," wrote Kipling. The initial defeats came as a terrible shock. If the empire floundered against 2 small republics, how could it stand against a great European power? The problem was compounded by Britain's lack of allies. Whereas France's isolation had been involuntary, for the British it was intentional. This policy was dubbed splendid isolation. Salisbury didn't believe in isolation per se. He was happy to work with other nations towards specific goals. But he absolutely refused to be drawn into any formal alliance. Such a commitment, he reasoned, could drag Britain into a war she didn't want to fight. The Boer War didn't shake Salisbury's belief in this strategy. But Salisbury was old. In 1899, his wife died. The next year, he retired from the Foreign Office. In 1902, at the conflict's end, he retired as Prime Minister. He died a year later. The steady retirement opened opportunities for a new direction, and Chamberlain was keen to seize them. The Boer War had convinced the colonial secretary that Britain needed allies. Throughout the conflict, an outpouring of Anglophobia in foreign newspapers had been too loud to ignore. There were even rumblings of French and Russian attempts to form a continental league aimed at intervening on the Boers' side. These plans came to naught, partly because of Austria and Germany. "In this war, I am completely English," Emperor Franz Joseph loudly declared to the British ambassador. The Kaiser, despite previously expressing pro-Boer sympathies, now batted away any notion of challenging Britain. It was to Germany, then, that Chamberlain looked. 3 times, the colonial secretary tried to reach out for some agreement. 3 times he was rebuffed. Although Wilhelm wavered between excitement and uncertainty, the new Chancellor, von Bülow, preferred to wait. He distrusted the British parliamentary system and felt that if he delayed, London's position would only grow weaker, allowing him to negotiate better terms. But Chamberlain was not a man to be spurned lightly. Ever the businessman, he decided that if Germany wouldn't buy his goods, he intended to take them elsewhere. The country he finally decided upon wasn't European at all. Japan had only opened its borders to the world 50 years earlier, but had been put through rapid modernizing reforms. By the turn of the century, it was a growing and ambitious power in the Far East. Salisbury, still Prime Minister, opposed any alliance when first suggested, but he was overruled by the cabinet. Alliance with Japan would allow part of the overstretched Royal Navy to be redeployed from the Far East. It would let Britain counter Russian influence in the region while committing very little. Decades of British policy had been overturned, and the reason for doing so was about to become clearer. But if Britain was going to abandon isolation, there was one more relationship that needed attention, and it required addressing the most bitter rivalry of the 19th century. In 1898, a tiny mud brick village on the Upper Nile had nearly caused a war between Britain and France. A small French military expedition, led by explorer Jean-Baptiste Marchand, had trekked across the interior of Africa to the Sudan. The British, then occupying Cairo, were the de jure rulers of this Egyptian colony. But the country was in revolt under the Mahdists, a fanatical Islamic group. If the French overpowered them and took control of the Upper Nile, British rule in Egypt would become untenable. Herbert Kitchener was dispatched with an Anglo-Egyptian army. Through a remarkable feat of logistics, he met and annihilated the Mahdist army at the Battle of Omdurman. Then he marched to meet the arriving French expedition at Fashoda. Kitchener brought an army of around 1,500. Marchand had 7 officers and just over 100 Senegalese troops. The outcome of any battle would have been foregone, but such a battle would have started a war. For a moment, it seemed war might come. But Salisbury calculated the French didn't want conflict. He was right. Paris backed down. Marchand withdrew. It was a humiliation the French public would not forget. When the Boer War came, the French press was probably the most vocally Anglophobic in Europe. Another century of competition seemed inevitable. Yet, while the rest of his country seethed, the new French foreign minister, Théophile Delcasse, sensed opportunity. Delcasse came from a modest background. Unprepossessing, nicknamed the Gnome for his small height, he wasn't brilliant. But he made up for it through determination, hard work, and fanatical patriotism. British weakness had been revealed by the war, but France's chances of recovering Egypt remained remote. Could this newly chastened Britain be an ally rather than an enemy? The French ambassador in London, Paul Cambon, certainly thought so. Cambon is one of the most amusing characters of the pre-war world. Despite spending 20 years in England, he refused to speak a word of the language. He thought the British culturally backward and objected to French schools in the country on grounds that any French children raised there ended up mentally retarded. Nonetheless, he argued that France and Britain were natural partners against the growing power of Germany. In 1903, King Edward VII crossed the Channel for a state visit, hoping to lay groundwork for future cooperation. His initial reception was frosty. Crowds shouted, "Vive for Shoda," as his carriage drove past. But Edward's charm was infectious. At the theatre, he complimented an actress in perfect French. Word spread throughout the city. By the time the king left, crowds were shouting, "Vive Edouard!" Delcasse reciprocated with a visit to London soon after. On April 8, 1904, he signed a series of agreements with Lansdowne, forming what would become known as the Entente Cordiale. The phrase is one most associated with the outbreak of the First World War, but what was agreed in 1904 shouldn't be overstated. Neither government saw the pact as directed against Germany. It was not an alliance. It gave no military guarantees. All it really did was settle outstanding colonial disputes, specifically giving France a free hand in Morocco and Britain one in Egypt. In Lansdowne's mind, this wasn't a radical break with previous British policy. Yet, the significance of the Entente couldn't be downplayed. It signalled that Britain's traditional isolation in Europe and tentative friendship with the Triple Alliance was at an end. Its old colonial rival was now to be treated as a reliable partner. Germany's usual strategy of playing London and Paris off against each other was now void. For France, it truly meant the end of Bismarck's system. Once upon a time, she'd been kept friendless by the Iron Chancellor's genius. Now it was Germany looking increasingly alone on the European stage. The only potential problem was that France was trying to serve two masters. Britain and Russia were nominally arch rivals, competing for influence throughout Central Asia and the Near East. In 1904, bringing them together seemed an impractical task. But when it mattered most, Russia could always be counted upon to collapse under its own weight. The Russian Empire, inherited by Nicholas II in 1894, was probably the most stable in its history. True, the Great Famine of 1891 had reawakened the radicalism briefly crushed by his father. But compared to the chaotic circumstances most of his predecessors had ascended the throne in, the apparent calm surrounding the new monarch's succession seemed a cause for optimism. The omens, however, were bad from the start. "I am not yet ready to be Tsar," Nicholas said. "I know nothing of the business of ruling." During the coronation festivities, a stampede at a celebration thrown for the peasantry ended with more than 1,200 dead. Nicholas's instinct was to spend the night in prayer, but he was convinced by advisers that this would insult the French, whose ambassador was hosting a reception that evening. The Tsar's decision to attend immediately soured his public reputation. Nicholas, at just 26, was a small man who had been towered over by his father, both literally and figuratively. Alexander III's sudden and untimely death at 49 had thrust upon Nicholas power he was clearly unprepared to wield. In personality, he was charming, but diffident and retiring. As governor, he was indecisive and changeable. The Kaiser compared his cousin to a pillow, always bearing the imprint of the last person who sat on him. Unlike Wilhelm, there was no hidden genius in Nicholas, held back by negative traits. No energy or particular dynamism. His goal was simply to maintain the absolute autocracy handed down by his father. He worked hard, refusing even a secretary, handling all correspondence and paperwork personally. These were the traits of a devoted middle manager. They were not the attributes needed in the supreme autocrat of a great empire. The conundrum was made worse by his choice of wife. Alix of Hesse was a love match whom Nicholas insisted on marrying despite complications relating to her German origins. A favourite granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she had impeccable familial credentials and great beauty. As Empress of Russia, though, she was not what was needed. Extremely shy, humourless, and highly strung, Alix could not lead the Petersburg social scene as expected. She never spoke a single pleasant word to anyone, said one critical observer. She might have been a block of ice, freezing everyone around her. She also struggled to conceive an heir. Between 1895 and 1901, 4 girls were born. None could inherit the Russian throne. Growing desperation to produce a boy meant that as pious Orthodox Christians, both she and Nicholas developed a tendency to associate with charlatans and crackpot mystics. When a son, Alexei, was finally born in 1904, he turned out to be a haemophiliac. The disease stops blood clotting properly, making even a minor cut potentially fatal. The imperial children's French tutor, Pierre Gilliard, later described one of the Tsarevich's more painful episodes. The Tsarevich was standing on a chair when he slipped and hit his right knee against the corner of furniture. The next day, he could not walk. The subcutaneous hemorrhage progressed, and the swelling spread down the leg. The skin was greatly distended, hardened under the force of blood, and caused pain which worsened every hour. The Tsaritsa was at her son's bedside from the first onset of the attack. She watched over him, surrounding him with tender love and care, trying 1,000 attentions to alleviate his sufferings. The Tsar came the moment he was free. He tried to comfort and amuse the boy, but the pain was stronger than his mother's caresses or his father's stories. At times the groans ceased, and he murmured one word, "Mummy." His mother kissed him on the hair, forehead, and eyes, as if the touch of her lips would relieve him of pain. Think of the torture of that mother, an impotent witness of her son's martyrdom. A mother who knew she herself was the cause of those sufferings, that she had transmitted the terrible disease against which human science was powerless. Desperate to relieve the pain, the imperial couple embraced the mystical, such as the now infamous monk Rasputin, who seemed able to ease the boy's suffering. All of this happened behind the high walls of Tsarskoye Selo, an estate outside St. Petersburg where the imperial family spent much of its time. Surrounded by thousands of guards and servants, they were shut off from the capital and the new Russia emerging in the country's cities. The empire Nicholas ruled over was vast. The census of 1897 gave an underestimate of 125 million inhabitants. Only 55 million were described as Great Russians. Like Austria-Hungary, the Tsar's dominions were incredibly multi-ethnic. Unlike Austria, he was far more determined to promote the Russification of these different groups. Jews probably had it worst, and were regularly subjected to brutal pogroms that the state turned a blind eye to. Roman Catholic Poles formed a large bulge on the empire's western border, and were generally most resistant to Orthodox Tsarism. Others, like the steppe's famed Cossack horsemen, were generously treated because of their loyalty to the regime. Despite repression and autocratic government, the empire was chronically undergoverned. The civil service was smaller than its Western counterparts, even though it had to manage a range of nationalized industries alongside running the second largest empire on earth. The Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, was expected to break up Russia's large revolutionary movement, with barely 1,000 members at its height. The Russian army was always the largest in Europe, able to draw upon a wealth of peasant manpower. But like most things in the empire, it was badly led and suffered from endemic corruption. The low literacy rate among troops, about 30 to 40% compared to 90% in the German army, caused problems, particularly with morale. Troops unable to understand what they were fighting for lacked staying power in modern industrial warfare. With the Tsar on good terms with the Kaiser and the Balkans relatively quiet, the first decade of Nicholas's reign focused on expansion in the east. Much was spearheaded by one of Russia's most capable statesmen, Finance Minister Sergei Witte. The Russian economy Witte inherited was the most backward of the great powers. Predominantly agrarian, its peasantry had only recently been emancipated from serfdom and remained burdened with large debt repayments. In per capita terms, she was poorer than Italy. Her industrial base was contemptible. Witte began transformation through high tariffs to stimulate manufacturing, joining the gold standard and drawing in foreign investment, particularly from the French. His pet project was the Trans-Siberian Railway, a massive scheme meant to open up Siberia and the Far East to trade and colonization. But Witte also had an ulterior motive. Rather than going entirely through Russia, he planned for part of the railway to go through China. China, in the late 19th century, was a stagnant and decaying empire that seemed destined to be carved up by the world's imperial powers. Witte hoped through this peaceful penetration, Russia would be in prime position. In reality, the entire project was a costly failure from the start. Port Arthur, its commercial twin Dalny, and the resources needed to connect them via railway cost far more than they would ever produce. The warm water port Russian jingoists prattled on about was basically useless. Russian trade in the Pacific was negligible and would be for the foreseeable future. Worse, this expansion now brought them into conflict with Japan. Tokyo, still a newcomer on the international stage, had been willing to compromise over Manchuria, but drew a red line at the Korean peninsula, which it was desperate to incorporate into its own empire. Nicholas refused to seriously negotiate with the Japanese. In February 1904, without a declaration of war, they staged a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The conflict that followed was a near-total disaster for the Russians. Port Arthur held out for 5 months in an epic siege, but was eventually overcome in January 1905. In Manchuria, desperate Russian efforts to drive the Japanese out culminated in bloody defeat at the giant Battle of Mukden, involving well over 500,000 men. Nicholas's last hope was a desperate ploy, sending Russia's Baltic fleet around the globe to cut the Japanese army off in Manchuria. But, the operation was a debacle. After a 9-month world tour, when the fleet finally arrived off the coast of Korea, it was annihilated in a single battle at Tsushima. Nicholas agreed to peace, negotiated skillfully by Witte. The Treaty of Portsmouth decided that Japan would dominate Korea, take half the island of Sakhalin, and gain Russian concessions in Manchuria. The war had cost Nicholas 400,000 casualties, most of his navy, and sent the empire's finances spiraling. The Minister of War had previously warned in 1903 that conflict with Japan would be extremely unpopular and would increase feeling of dissatisfaction with the ruling authorities. This was to prove an understatement. In a regime with limited popular legitimacy and a significant revolutionary movement, war and defeat is a dangerous concoction. The effects were unsurprising. The 1905 revolution is inevitably overshadowed by its triumphant successor 12 years later. But the monarchy very nearly collapsed that winter. Had it done so, Russia's defeat by Japan would have looked trivial by comparison. The whole European diplomatic system would have been sent into meltdown. The Kaiser made a serious promise to the large German Baltic community that if the monarchy fell, he would intervene to protect them. One suspects this probably terrified rather than reassured them. In January 1905, while the war was still at its height, a march led by a government informant, Father Gapon, arrived at the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar demanding more political rights. The authorities, already jumpy, called out the army, which responded by shooting at least a few hundred of the protesters in a series of confrontations. The atrocity sparked strikes and riots across the empire. As spring came, discontent spread to the peasantry in the provinces, especially where ethnic minorities were dominant. On the Black Sea, the battleship Potemkin mutinied. The Tsar turned to Witte again. Witte was no democrat. He had strenuously argued that only an absolute monarchy could impose the modernizing reforms he advocated. But neither was he an ideologue, and he understood compromise was necessary. He proposed that Nicholas bow to the necessity of limited concessions. In what became known as the October Manifesto, the Tsar promised new civil rights and the introduction of a Duma, a sort of parliament that would be able to vote on most legislation and scrutinize ministers. Such concessions have a habit of encouraging rather than containing opposition. That winter was an extremely close-run thing. A battalion from Nicholas's own regiment mutinied. Just enough of the army remained loyal, which allowed for suppression of the uprisings by summer 1906. Nicholas came out of the revolution with his power largely still intact. Indeed, once the government re-established control of the country, he was able to tweak the electoral laws for the Duma, which gave it a much more conservative composition. He then fired Witte, though only after the finance minister negotiated a large French loan to stave off bankruptcy. But the revolution had weakened Russia at a critical moment is less than #0. 5 is greater than part of the reason for ending the Japanese War, just when some of the empire's best divisions were finally being transferred to the front was because of the crisis. Throughout every court in Europe, everybody knew that, for the moment, Russia was no longer a great power. It was an opportunity Germany did not intend to waste. On March 31, 1905, the German steamer Hamburg anchored off the Moroccan city of Tangiers. Landing a few hours later was Kaiser Wilhelm II. Greeted by the Sultan's uncle, he was given a white Arabian horse and led through the town's narrow streets to the acclaim of its citizenry. Wilhelm had initially been reluctant to make the visit. It had been the foreign ministry in Berlin that cajoled Hamburg's crew into bringing him, hoping it would make a statement as to Germany's influence in the region. But now he was here, the Kaiser was excited. Morocco was an independent country, and he expected Paris to recognize Germany's legitimate interests there, he declared to the French representative in the town. If the Wilhelmstrasse had wanted to make a scene, they had succeeded. Everybody in Europe read the visit as a challenge to France's grip on Morocco, which had been rapidly tightening since the Entente with Britain. Delcassé had been determined not even to inform Berlin of French intentions with the country. In response, Germany now demanded, at the very least, recognition of its commercial interests, or, if not, compensation in the form of colonies elsewhere. But Morocco was really the thin end of the wedge. Chancellor Bülow's real hope was that a crisis could be used to break up the burgeoning Anglo-French Entente, perhaps even the Franco-Russian alliance. This would destroy the ring beginning to form around Germany, characterized by the term encirclement, a phrase that was to become all too common in minds at the German Foreign Office over the following decade. The Kaiser did not want war in 1905. He wasn't sure Germany would win it, and struggled to understand why Morocco was worth risking it. But Bülow and Holstein were convinced that if Germany held its nerve, Britain would crumble, the French would follow, and the Entente would be destroyed to a great enhancement of German prestige. Russia, tied up with war in the East and revolution at home, could do nothing. Having received German support, the Moroccan Sultan rejected a set of French-proposed governmental reforms. Berlin announced it wanted an international conference on the country's future. Delcassé, who by this point had become a sort of bogeyman in the Wilhelmstrasse, would also need to be dismissed, the Germans indicated to Rouvier, the French Prime Minister. Rouvier convinced himself the Germans weren't bluffing, and that any war would result in a defeat as great as 1871. This was absurd. Had war broken out in 1905, the French would have had every chance of winning on their own. The Germans had not yet implemented lessons from the Russo-Japanese War. Their armies were still clothed in bright blue uniforms. Even Wilhelm noted the French 75 gun, a devastating light artillery piece that far outmatched anything Germany could field, was reason to back down. Nonetheless, Paris caved. In June 1905, Delcassé was dismissed. Throughout both France and Britain, there was shock at this bizarre capitulation. If Berlin had taken such an emphatic victory and gone home, the Moroccan adventure could have been considered a great success. But the Germans now overplayed their hand. While the French tried to offer colonial compensation elsewhere, Bülow continued to demand a conference where he still hoped to split the Entente once and for all. In both France and Britain, resolve to stand against Germany now stiffened. The new British Foreign Secretary indicated that Paris would have his country's support in any conflict. He even authorized informal military talks over how best Britain could send aid in a European war. When the conference finally convened in Algeciras in 1906, it was a farce. Only Austria supported Germany's demands for the internationalization of Morocco's police and financial institutions. Britain, Russia, America, Spain, and even Italy, officially Germany's ally, all backed France. If I had been told about this, the Kaiser said later, that idiotic conference would never have taken place. Germany accepted a face-saving compromise of minor colonial concessions elsewhere, but it was clear their real aim of destroying the Entente had comprehensively failed. Indeed, in Britain, the aggressive stubbornness of German actions had gone a long way to convincing previous Entente skeptics of the agreement's utility. We are face to face with the same state of things which existed in Europe under Charles V, Louis XIV, and Napoleon, claimed the advisor Springrice. The only issue is either submission to the dictator or a defensive war. This was, of course, hysterical nonsense in 1905. Yet even a foreign secretary as Germanophile as Lansdowne was incredulous at the Wilhelmstrasse's manner. It represented an obvious change in how Whitehall viewed Berlin. Despite the Kruger telegram and subsequent naval build-up, British statesmen until 1905 had generally tried to give Germany the benefit of the doubt internationally. After, relations were consistently plagued by a deep and abiding suspicion of German intentions. But the Moroccan crisis did not change Germany's course. Stung by humiliation, the lesson Berlin took was that international conferences were now useless, as Germany was always likely to be outvoted. This was yet another plank of the old order being removed. The conference had for nearly 100 years been a key defender of European peace, allowing disputes between great powers to be hammered out face to face without war. Germany's decision to abandon them was to have particularly fatal consequences in 1914. The European alliance system was becoming more rigid by the year, just as the last great power was entering into it. Two military disasters defined the trajectory of the Habsburg Empire for the last half-century of its existence. In 1859, Austria lost the bloody Battle of Solferino to a Franco-Piedmontese army, and with it the rich Italian province of Lombardy. Venice would follow soon after, ejecting Vienna from all remaining influence in the peninsula. Then, in 1866, Prussia destroyed Austria's hold on Germany with a crushing victory at Königgrätz. Habsburg power over Central Europe, dominant for half a millennium, was wiped out in a single day. What was left of the Austrian Empire seemed an uninspiring rump. Rather than a nation-state like France or Germany, containing a single dominant ethnicity, the Habsburg realms were an eclectic mix of races, nationalities, and creeds. Germans, Italians, Czechs, Magyars, Slavs, Poles, Romanians, and Ruthenese, held together only by the ancient and creaking House of Habsburg. Bismarck was forging Germany into the most powerful nation on the continent. The Habsburgs were trying to work out which language was spoken in Stropkov. The defeat of 1866 transformed the empire. In its aftermath, the Austrian government, until then ruled by Germans from Vienna, agreed to a compromise with the second largest ethnicity, the Magyars. They would rule a reborn kingdom of Hungary, dominant in the east, while Vienna continued to govern the west. For practical purposes, this new order is often referred to as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, though the name is something of a misnomer. As far as the Magyars were concerned, their kingdom was completely independent. That the Emperor of Austria was also King of Hungary was mere coincidence. In reality, there had to be some connecting ministries. Foreign affairs and defense, including a joint army, continued to link the two halves of this odd realm. But the disjointed nature of the political arrangement caused endless problems. The Hungarians were fearful of Vienna reasserting control and purposely kneecapped military spending increases. This left the Habsburg army falling behind its European peers to the extent that Britain, with a much smaller volunteer force, was soon outspending Austria's larger conscript army. The situation was more tolerable for other minorities. Those under Austrian rule met in a joint parliament in Vienna, elected after 1907 by universal male suffrage. Meant to inspire cooperation, it was instead a tribute to what disasters the Tower of Babel has wrought on human progress. There was no common language among the deputies, and very few translators. When an Italian spoke, no one could be sure whether they were listening to the equivalent of Antony's funeral oration or were being denounced as subhumans. Czech delegates were especially fond of reading out their dinner menus with dramatic gusto. Fortunately, for most of the empire's inhabitants, the parliament was little more than a gilded talking shop. Its decisions were of limited impact, and it was regularly closed when delegates became too intransigent. "My role is to protect my people from their politicians," the emperor once said. Real power remained with him and his civil service. An army of over 3 million bureaucrats that governed the empire, when all was said and done, fairly competently. None of them knew how to solve the national question, of course. Yet in spite of it, there was an odd stability to everything. In the last decades before the war, strong economic growth smoothed over a lot of internal tensions. Few had enough time for infighting when they were busy getting rich. A vast customs union between Austria and Hungary stimulated trade and technological progress. The Czechs had the great Skoda munitions works, rivaled only by Krupp in Germany. The fertile plains of Hungary fed the whole monarchy. New natural resources, like oil, were being discovered in the Polish territories. Generally, minority demands were for greater autonomy and power within the monarchy, not outright independence. If Austria did not exist, she would have to be invented, announced one Czech nationalist. The situation was always desperate but not serious, quipped one Viennese journalist. Above it all was the emperor, Franz Joseph. With his immediately recognizable whiskers, deep blue eyes, and military dress, he was the embodiment of a rapidly fading 19th century. He had ascended the throne in 1848, at a time when revolutions were tearing the monarchy apart. Through the iron hand of his military, the young emperor had re-established control. But from then on, the story had been one of decline. The loss of Italy and Germany had destroyed the empire's preeminent role in European affairs. Franz Joseph's personal life had mirrored his empire's tragic fate. His wife Elizabeth was assassinated in 1898 by an anarchist. His only son and heir, Rudolf, had taken his own life in 1889. "I have been spared nothing in this world," Franz Joseph muttered quietly. Throughout it all, the emperor continued to work. Rising just after 4 in the morning and usually remaining at his desk until evening, with determined efficiency, he fulfilled his duties. No empire in decline has yet produced a visionary. Franz Joseph was above all an administrator. The death of the emperor's only son meant the status of heir apparent passed to a nephew, Franz Ferdinand. Cold, charmless, and authoritarian, his only real passion was for massacring wildlife on the hunt. As future head of the most prestigious dynasty in Europe, he was expected to marry well. Instead, he fell in love with a lady-in-waiting, Sophie Chotek. The Choteks were Bohemian nobility, but for a dynasty whose success had been founded on marriage, this wasn't good enough. When Franz Joseph finally gave way, after intercessions from both the Pope and the German Kaiser, it was on condition that the marriage remain morganatic. Sophie would never be an empress. No children would ever inherit the crown, and Franz Ferdinand believed his uncle took personal pleasure in slighting her at every possible opportunity. Franz Ferdinand spent most of his time at the Grand Belvedere Palace in Vienna, where he set up a sort of shadow court. He encouraged a range of theorists and politicians to offer visions of how to reform the Habsburg monarchy. One suggested giving each minority a small territory of their own, a United States of Austria. Another argued for giving the Slavs their own kingdom, like Hungary. Franz Ferdinand seems to have eventually settled on revoking the compromise with the Hungarians, whom he despised, and reordering the empire into more of a federated state. Though he himself would rule most things from Vienna without a parliament if possible. 25 years of consultations, and the end result was "shut up and do what I say." By the 1880s, the Habsburg Empire had settled into its new geopolitical reality. The old order in Italy and Germany was gone. Bismarck's Prussia stood dominant, leaving only one region still open to Austrian influence, the Balkans. The peninsula largely remained under Ottoman control, but if Austria was considered a sick man by some, the Turks appeared to be on life support. Broke, corrupt, and ruling over minorities that hated it, nobody expected Constantinople to maintain its hold indefinitely. The concern for Austria was what came next. Much of the peninsula had Orthodox and Slavic populations naturally more inclined to Russian rather than Catholic and German Habsburg influence. Bismarck's web of agreements kept a lid on these tensions, but they could never be wholly exorcised. In 1878, Austria had occupied the Ottoman province of Bosnia-Herzegovina with the consent of the other European powers. Its mandate was for administrative and economic reform, which it carried out energetically. Opposition was cracked down on ruthlessly, but on the whole, the Austrians thought of themselves as a force for progress. Quite why the Habsburgs actually needed Bosnia, apart from the usual vague waffle about countering Russian influence, nobody could explain. Indeed, all the economic advancement in the world could not shake the fact that Austria had absorbed yet another sizable minority. Given the chance, a significant portion would have preferred to unite with the small Serbian state across the border. Until 1903, Serbia was actually an Austrian ally. The Serbian king Milan was an avowed Austrophile. But in 1903, a putsch organized by a group of officers saw husband and wife butchered in the royal palace. Among the conspirators was a young soldier named Dragutin Dimitrijević, known more commonly by his nickname Apis, a product of the new ultranationalism beginning to grow within the Serbian military. King Alexander's replacement was the Karađorđević dynasty, more liberal in political persuasion but also willing to take a harder line against Austria. Parts of the military hoped they would center Belgrade's foreign policy around expansion, liberating all surrounding Serbians. Everyone agreed Serbia must become independent of Austria and draw closer to Russia. But that was about all. The 1903 revolution meant Austria had lost a loyal vassal in the Balkans. The Habsburgs reacted violently when Serbia tried to escape economic dependence by entering a customs union with Bulgaria and sourcing loans from Paris. Austria announced an embargo on pork, Belgrade's main export. This tariff war was to continue for 5 years, but the Serbs refused to concede. Instead, they found new markets throughout the rest of Europe. The small victory meant Belgrade would remain independent. But in the Balkans, independent usually meant pro-Russian. I had a peculiar passion for the Navy, Wilhelm wrote years later in his memoirs. It sprang to no small extent from my English blood. As a child, Wilhelm had frequented Osborne House, his grandmother's seaside retreat on the Isle of Wight. 5 miles away, across the Solent, was the Royal Navy's base at Portsmouth. There he could gaze upon the warships that had won England an empire. I admired the proud English ships in those two superb harbours, he recalled. Then there awoke in me the wish to build ships of my own like these some day, and when I was grown up to possess as fine a navy as the English. In 1890, the American historian Alfred Mahan published his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. In it, he outlined how naval superiority had brought about Great Britain's rise to hegemony. The Kaiser was enthralled. He ordered all of his naval officers to read the book. The only problem was that he had almost no naval officers to order. Prussia had always been a land power, and Bismarck had never seen any need for more than a small flotilla dedicated to coastal defence. But without a navy, how could Germany ever hope to be a world power like Britain? Its overseas empire, trade, and communications would always be dependent on the Royal Navy's goodwill. Without a navy, the British would always look down their noses at Germany and Wilhelm. Fortunately, the Kaiser had met a man who shared his vision. Perhaps the most impressive thing about soon-to-be Rear Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz was his ability to sport a forked beard and still be taken seriously. He was a self-made man, having climbed the small, greasy pole of the Imperial Navy entirely on merit. He was not likable, domineering, aggressive, ruthless, but undoubtedly brilliant. Wilhelm had first noticed Tirpitz in 1890 at a dinner hosted for his admirals. When he asked for suggestions on creating a fleet, only Tirpitz gave the Kaiser an answer he liked. Germany must have battleships. Those equally beautiful and terrifying vessels that Britain used to impose her will on the world. Like the Kaiser, Tirpitz both admired and loathed the British. He spoke English fluently, read English novels, and held deep reverence for the Royal Navy. But he bristled at their patronising attitudes. "Don't they look just like sailors?" He remembered an English woman gasping after seeing a then-Lieutenant Tirpitz and his crew dock at Gibraltar. The solution was simple. Even the greatest sea state in Europe would be more towards us if we were able to throw 2 or 3 highly trained squadrons into the political scales, he said. Wilhelm was enthusiastic, but changeable. He swayed between the extravagant heavy battle fleet demanded by Tirpitz and the more limited expansion advocated by others. Most of the German public struggled to understand why the country needed more ships. In 1895, the Kaiser asked for 36 cruisers. The Reichstag gave him 4. Then, in June 1898, Tirpitz delivered a memorandum to Wilhelm detailing his plan for an expansive fleet focused around battleships. Such a heavy navy would be of little use against France, and overkill for dealing with Russia. Against Britain, though, Tirpitz argued, it would finally give Germany the tools to negotiate effectively. The Admiral carefully laid groundwork for a new naval bill through tedious persuasion and pandering. In March 1898, it became law, providing for 7 new modern battleships. Not enough to seriously trouble the British, but it was a start. 2 years later, with the Boer War raging in South Africa, the Reichstag authorized a second naval law, doubling the size of the future German fleet from 19 to 38 battleships is less than #0. 5# is greater than. This massive increase had been made possible by Britain's interception of 3 German mail steamers suspected of carrying contraband to the Boers. Throughout the Reich, there was outrage. What could Germany do? Without a navy, she was impotent. The sentiment was seized upon by Tirpitz, who in a preamble to the new law set out his thinking. His ideas became known as risk theory. Britain would not risk war with a Germany capable of deploying a powerful fleet. The Royal Navy was scattered around the globe, defending the trade routes of a strung-out empire. The high seas fleet could be concentrated in the North Sea. The odds would favour the Germans. At the very least, the Royal Navy would take a battering in any fight. Thus, the British would not dare risk antagonising them. Eventually, Tirpitz argued, they would hopefully be brought into the Triple Alliance on German terms. A rough wooing indeed. If it was an alliance the Kaiser and Tirpitz genuinely hoped for, one suspects Flowers might have done the job more effectively. Instead, the Kaiser's empire had a new rival to face. In August 1902, another great naval review took place at Spithead to mark the coronation of Edward VII. Queen Victoria had died peacefully on January 22, 1901. Despite the losses of the Boer War, the review at Spithead was a very clear statement that Britannia's rule of the waves remained unchallenged. The initial steps taken by the Germans toward building a fleet had not immediately concerned the British. In 1898, the Admiralty was more bothered with the naval threat posed by the Franco-Russian alliance. 9 years earlier, the government had brought in the Naval Defence Act, making it a legal requirement that Britain maintain a number of battleships at least equal to the next two largest navies combined, namely France and Russia. By 1902, however, alarm bells were beginning to ring. Tirpitz's declaration in that year's naval bill perhaps offered a clue. The more the composition of the new German fleet is examined, the clearer it becomes that it is designed for a possible conflict with the British fleet, wrote the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Selborne. This new hostility came as a shock. Britain had always generally viewed Berlin as friendly, if slightly erratic. Germany was not overtly hostile during the Boer War, certainly when compared to France and Russia. German intentions could not be ignored. The Royal Navy was Britain's lifeline, both sword and shield. Not just the empire, but the country's very existence depended on it. If it could be bested by a hostile state, Britain's time as a great power would have come to an end. The British fear was not the Kaiser possessing a navy. Nobody in London objected to a German fleet per se. What they had to respond to was a battle fleet whose composition and intention was explicitly to defeat Britons in the North Sea. Tirpitz had thrown down a gauntlet that could not be ignored. The man who would pick it up was Admiral Jackie Fisher. Small and stocky with an odd-looking face, his grey eyes were set far apart, with heavy eyelids giving them an almond shape. A strange, almost yellow tint affected his skin, to the extent it was rumoured Fisher was actually Malayan. Charming, bombastic, supremely self-confident, and undoubtedly brilliant, he was the ultimate divisive figure. Fisher's main task was to counter the German naval build-up, while also reducing naval expenditure. The way to do so, he decided, was to revolutionise Britain's trident. Unchallenged for a century, the Royal Navy in 1905 was strung out around the globe, divided into small squadrons. Fisher decided to recall most of the fleet to home waters, combining it into one large armada capable of smashing the Germans in the North Sea. 154 older and obsolete vessels, too weak to fight and too slow to run away, as Fisher famously called them, were scrapped. The savings these measures brought reduced naval estimates dramatically. But the first Sea Lord had only just begun. His aim wasn't simply to counter the Germans. He meant to put the fear of God into them. On February 10, 1906, HMS Dreadnought was launched at Portsmouth. She was the largest, fastest, and most powerful battleship in the world. 18,000 tons, capable of 21 knots, driven by modern turbine engines, and crucially armed with 10 12-inch guns. It was the most terrifying advancement in naval technology for decades, and it immediately rendered the Royal Navy's vast numerical superiority completely worthless. The German Navy, after an initial code brown and change of pants, accepted the challenge. Within 2 years, they had launched their own dreadnought, SMS Nassau. The Liberals now had a problem. Dreadnought had originally been built as a cost-saving exercise. Instead, it looked like she was about to send the arms race into overdrive. In 1909 came the crisis. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Reginald McKenna, requested 6 dreadnoughts, followed by another 6 in 1910 and another 6 in 1911. The calculations were based upon German naval plans. If Britain only ordered 4 dreadnoughts in 1909, by 1912 Germany would have had 13 and Britain 16. Worse, there were constant rumours that Germany was secretly speeding up construction. The great Krupp manufacturing works in Essen were said to be holding huge warehouses of naval gun barrels. The Admiralty thought it a practical certainty that Germany would actually have 17 dreadnoughts by 1912. If she used all her dockyards, she would have 21. This was verging on hysterical. In Cabinet, McKenna was vigorously opposed by 2 up-and-coming ministers, David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. Both were firmly committed to the radical wing of the party and refused to consider the extra expenditure. Asquith, now Prime Minister, solved the crisis by suggesting 4 dreadnoughts be laid down as expected, with another 4 to follow if close monitoring revealed them necessary. To get the bill through Parliament, McKenna declared, "No matter what the cost, the safety of the country must be assured." This revelation threw the opposition into outrage. A Tory MP coined the phrase, "We want 8 and we won't wait." Soon this cry was ringing throughout the country. In July 1909, it was revealed Austria planned at least 3 dreadnoughts, and Italy announced another 4. The Admiralty's case became irresistible. The 4 contingency orders were placed. In the end, a curious solution was reached, Churchill later said. The Admiralty had demanded 6 ships, the economists offered 4, and we finally compromised on 8. Naval spending rocketed from £32.2 million in 1908 to 1909 to £48.8 million in 1913 to 14. But as Churchill later magnanimously admitted, it had been the correct choice. In 1912, Germany, having never actually intended to build any ships secretly, had 13 dreadnoughts in commission. Great Britain had 22. Tirpitz's dream had ended in nightmare. In 1908, the Balkans roared back to the front of the international stage, threatening as usual to drag all Europe into war. Ironically, the troubled peninsula had been relatively quiet for more than a decade. Though Austria and Russia were no longer bound by the Three Emperors League, they seemed to get along better outside its constraints. In 1897, they had informally agreed to both maintain the status quo in the region. The underlying variable, however, was Russia's focus on the East and Austria's wary respect for the Great Bear's power. Now, with its Asian aspirations checked, St. Petersburg was beginning to look west again. Just as Vienna sensed opportunity to take advantage of Russian weakness, the Habsburgs had always defended their prerogative to legally annex Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Balkan territory it occupied, since 1878. For 30 years, Vienna had preferred to avoid this awkward conversation. But in 1908, the occupation statute was due to expire. The Austrian foreign minister, Alois von Ehrenthal, thought now the time to formally incorporate the territory. Tall, slightly stooped, with fine features and hooded eyes, Ehrenthal came from a family of Czech aristocrats and had risen steadily through the diplomatic service. The advantages of annexation were obvious, a prestige boost for an empire desperately in need of it. For Ehrenthal, absorbing Bosnia would be the start of a more ambitious foreign policy. A passionate Austrian patriot, he was deeply concerned by the monarchy's growing dependence on Germany. A bold international statement would prove the Habsburgs remained an independent great power. The clinching argument came in summer 1908, when the Young Turks forced the Ottoman Sultan to proclaim a constitution. Rumours reached Vienna that Bosnia, still legally Turkish territory, would be offered its own political settlement. Ehrenthal moved quickly to prepare for formal annexation. To do so, however, he first had to square Russia. Despite his subsequently infamous reputation, Ehrenthal was a firm believer in improving relations with St. Petersburg. He hoped settling the Bosnian issue would be the prelude to a new era of détente between the two empires. History does so love its ironies. The new Russian foreign minister, Izvolsky, had no objection to the Austrian annexation, providing the Tsar was amply compensated. In particular, he had his mind on a revision of the Straits Agreement. If Russia could revise this, allowing her navy alone to move between the Black and Mediterranean seas, she would have won a major strategic prize. On September 16, 1908, Ehrenthal and Izvolsky met at the Moravian estate of the Austrian ambassador to Russia. The atmosphere was not cordial. Ehrenthal despised Izvolsky for his liberalism. Izvolsky despised Ehrenthal for previous diplomatic slights. Negotiations to finalize the quid pro quo were conducted in a single day, and there was enormous controversy about what had been agreed. No formal minutes were taken, and no accurate record ever established. But it seems the Russians agreed to support the Austrian annexation, and the Austrians agreed to support Russian military access to the Straits. The main problem was that no timetable for these events was firmly established. Izvolsky was playing a dangerous game. Is less than #0, 5#, is greater than he, understood Russian public opinion might recoil at letting the Habsburgs annex fellow Slavs, especially if he was unable to open the straits. But he was willing to roll the dice. Unfortunately, the result was snake eyes. When he arrived in Paris on October 4th to sound out the French, he found a letter from Ehrenthal stating the announcement of annexation would be in 3 days. Ehrenthal appears to have boasted about tricking Izvolsky as to the exact timing. Those extra few days would have allowed Izvolsky to broach the matter with his allies before Vienna's announcement upstaged him. Gray was sympathetic to Izvolsky's position and said he was open to revising the Straits Agreement, but couldn't possibly commit with British public opinion, already excited by the Bosnian annexation. Izvolsky agreed with his British and French counterparts that a conference should be called to discuss the annexation and possible compensation for Serbia. This was where the Ehrenthal-Izvolsky pact collapsed. The Austrian foreign minister hated the idea of a conference and flatly refused to even discuss compensation for Serbia. The Germans, happy to have an opportunity to punish Russia for siding with the British since 1905, backed Vienna. Neither Britain nor France cared enough to press the issue. Ehrenthal swaggered off with his prize, leaving Izvolsky with egg on his face. The reaction in Russia was predictable. Austria had just annexed a province filled with fellow Slavs and was claiming it had Russian support in doing so. St. Petersburg had gotten nothing. The Prime Minister, Stolypin, was furious at having been kept in the dark. The Russian press relentlessly published article after article condemning Izvolsky. At a meeting of the Council of Ministers in November 1908, Izvolsky admitted he had underestimated the impact of annexation on Russian public opinion. This was true. Although Aehrenthal had acted with low cunning by announcing early, Izvolsky had sown much of this whirlwind himself by trying to trade Bosnia for a concession the British and French were never guaranteed to back. The crisis rattled on throughout the winter and into spring 1909 as the Russians tried to force the issue. But by then the Austrians were bored. Aehrenthal decided to end the matter once and for all by threatening to publish documents signed by Izvolsky that promised to support the annexation. Finally, on March 22, 1909, Germany also stepped in. Russia was told to recognize the annexation or face the consequences. War was impossible for Russia in 1909. Still wounded by the Manchurian debacle, the Tsar's intelligence reported Germany's superiority in artillery made conflict impractical. Besides, the French made clear they had no interest getting involved in a spat over the Balkans. The result was that St. Petersburg finally obliged. The Bosnian annexation was recognized. The straits remained closed to Russian warships. Is less than Hashon. 5 hash is greater than. The Bosnian crisis in hindsight seems like many of the pre-war spats, a storm in a teacup. But if you had to pick one incident before 1914 that explained the conflict, this would be a good contender. The crisis permanently poisoned relations between Austria, Serbia, and Russia. Until then, St. Petersburg and Vienna had been on relatively friendly terms. After, there was no question of the détente Aehrenthal had once hoped for. Even German relations with Russia had been burned by the crisis. Nicholas, who just over a year earlier had gone out of his way to ensure Germany took no offence at the agreement with Britain, now fumed at the Kaiser's guarded threat of war. "It is true," he wrote to his mother, "that the form and method adopted by the Germans in their treatment of us was rude, and that we won't forget. I think that once again they were seeking to split us from France and England, but once again did not succeed." Izvolsky survived as foreign minister for another 18 months before being given the comfortable ambassadorship in Paris. His ideas survived him in office, though. Izvolsky's argument that Russia's future was in the West remained government policy. In 1909, Russia had been too weak to achieve his ambitious aims. But with the country recovering rapidly, everyone was certain that when the next challenge came, they would not be humiliated again. When the guns opened fire in 1914, Izvolsky shouted, "This is my war, is less than #3. 0 hash is greater than." In July 1911, Germany almost triggered a European war over a place most Germans couldn't locate on a map. The Moroccan question had been settled at Algeciras in 1906. France was given a free hand to establish a protectorate over the country. But by 1911, the Sultan's authority had collapsed, and French troops occupied the capital Fez to restore order. Berlin seized on this as a violation of the Algeciras settlement. The new Foreign Secretary, Alfred von Keidel-Wächter, decided Germany needed compensation. His idea was to send a gunboat to the Moroccan port of Agadir as a show of force, then negotiate for French colonial territories elsewhere, ideally the entire French Congo. The Kaiser was initially reluctant. "If we appeared on the scene in Morocco with exaggerated demands and in a bullying fashion, the French would certainly appeal to England," he warned. But Keidel-Wächter dismissed such concerns. Britain had no treaty obligation to France. She wouldn't go to war over Morocco. On July 1st, 1911, the German gunboat Panther anchored off Agadir. The international response was immediate and hostile. The French were stunned but resolved not to back down as they had in 1905. Germany had created a crisis out of thin air. If Paris caved again, French credibility would be destroyed. The new Prime Minister, Joseph Caillaux, was prepared to offer colonial compensation, but the German demands were outrageous. Britain's response was even more dramatic. Grey, the Foreign Secretary, had tried for years to maintain cordial relations with Germany despite the naval race. He viewed the Agadir incident as a deliberate provocation, Germany testing whether Britain would honour its commitments to France. In cabinet, he argued Britain must stand firm. The alternative was watching the Entente collapse and facing Germany alone. Lloyd George, previously a fierce opponent of increased military spending, was tasked with sending Germany a message. On July 21st, at a banquet at the Mansion House, the Chancellor delivered what became known as the Mansion House speech. If a situation were to be forced upon us in which peace could only be preserved by the surrender of the great and beneficent position Britain has won by centuries of heroism and achievement, he declared, by allowing Britain to be treated where her interests were vitally affected, as if she were of no account in the cabinet of nations, then I say emphatically that peace at that price would be a humiliation intolerable for a great country like ours to endure. The meaning was unmistakable. Britain would go to war if necessary. In Berlin, there was shock and rage. Kiedel and Wächter had miscalculated catastrophically. Not only had Britain refused to stand aside, she'd made clear any future German aggression would bring her into the fight. The German press howled for war. The word has now been spoken which can only be answered by the sword, thundered one newspaper. But Germany wasn't ready for war in 1911. The navy was still inferior to Britain's. The army hadn't been expanded to match France's recent increases. Reluctantly, Berlin backed down. In November 1911, France and Germany signed an agreement. Paris ceded small strips of the French Congo to Germany in exchange for recognition of the French protectorate over Morocco. It was a face-saving compromise, but everyone knew Germany had lost. Kiedel and Wächter tried to spin it as a victory. "We have come out of the affair very well," he claimed. Nobody believed him. The German public saw it as another humiliation. Tirpitz's risk theory had failed spectacularly. Instead of deterring Britain, the German fleet had achieved nothing. The crisis had profound effects. In Britain, the Committee of Imperial Defence, a body that coordinated military planning, now began detailed preparations for sending an expeditionary force to France in case of war. Military conversations between British and French staff officers intensified. Grey remained careful to avoid a formal alliance, but in practice, Britain was becoming militarily committed to France. In Germany, the lesson drawn was different. The government concluded that future crises must be backed by overwhelming military force. In 1912, the Reichstag approved massive increases in army funding. A new army bill added 136,000 men to the peacetime strength. Provisions were made to nearly double this in wartime. The German General Staff also began serious planning for a two-front war against France and Russia. The famous Schlieffen Plan, a sweeping offensive through Belgium to knock France out quickly before turning east, was refined and updated. If war came, Germany would strike first and strike hard. Meanwhile, Tirpitz pushed through yet another naval novelle in 1912, adding 3 more dreadnoughts. The British responded by laying down 5 super dreadnoughts in 1912 and another 4 in 1913. The naval race was reaching its crescendo. Germany would never catch up. For France, Agadir was a wake-up call. The crisis had shown that Germany was willing to risk war over colonial disputes. It also revealed that French forces were unprepared. The army began urgent reforms. Most dramatically, in 1913, the period of conscription was extended from 2 years to 3. This decision was bitterly controversial. The socialists opposed it fiercely, but it passed. Russia, too, accelerated its military build-up. The Great Program, approved in 1913, called for massive expansion of the army and improvements to the railway network near the German and Austrian borders. By 1917, Russia would be able to mobilize faster than Germany had thought possible. The arms race was now in full swing. Every nation was preparing for a war most hoped would never come. But in the Balkans, the fuse was already lit. In October 1912, the Ottoman Empire faced its greatest crisis in centuries. 4 Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, declared war on Turkey simultaneously. For decades, the great powers had debated what to do about the sick man of Europe. The question was now answered by the Balkan states themselves. They had decided to carve up the Ottoman territories in Europe without asking permission. The war was shockingly one-sided. Within weeks, the Bulgarians had pushed to within 20 miles of Constantinople. The Serbs and Greeks swept through Macedonia. Montenegro laid siege to Škoda in Albania. By December, the Ottomans sued for peace. The Treaty of London, signed in May 1913, stripped Turkey of nearly all its European territories. The great powers insisted on creating an independent Albania to prevent Serbia from gaining access to the Adriatic Sea. This infuriated Belgrade, which had counted on a port as its prize. But the real problem was Bulgaria. Having done most of the fighting, the Bulgarians expected the lion's share of Macedonia. Serbia and Greece disagreed. Tensions escalated rapidly. In June 1913, barely a month after the First War ended, Bulgaria attacked its former allies. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Serbia, Greece, Romania, and even the Ottoman Empire all declared war on Bulgaria. The Second Balkan War lasted just 33 days. Bulgaria was crushed. The Treaty of Bucharest in August 1913 redrew the Balkan map again. Serbia nearly doubled its territory, gaining much of Macedonia. Its population grew from 2.9 million to 4.4 million. The Serbs were jubilant. In Vienna, there was alarm. Austria had watched the Balkan Wars with growing horror. Serbia, Austria's main rival in the region, had emerged as the clear victor. Worse, Belgrade was becoming increasingly aggressive. Serbian military intelligence had formed a secret organization called Unification or Death, commonly known as the Black Hand. Its goal was to unite all South Slavs under Serbian leadership, including those in Austria-Hungary. The head of the Black Hand was Colonel Dragutin Dimitrievich, the same officer who'd participated in the coup of 1903. Known by his code name Apis, he was a fanatical nationalist who believed violence was justified to achieve Serbian expansion. The organization recruited young radicals and trained them in terrorism. Franz Ferdinand, still the heir to the Habsburg throne, was deeply troubled. He'd long advocated a more conciliatory approach to the South Slavs, hoping to reform the empire into a federation. But now he began to believe force might be necessary. If the monarchy doesn't pull itself together, he warned, it will collapse in a few years. The Austrian chief of staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, went further. He'd been demanding a preventive war against Serbia for years. During the Balkan Wars, he'd proposed attacking Serbia 25 times. Each time, the Hungarian government and the Emperor Franz Joseph had blocked him. Franz Joseph, now 83 years old, remained opposed to war. He'd seen too much bloodshed in his long reign. "If the monarchy must go down," he said wearily, "let it go down decently." But the Balkan Wars had fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Serbia was no longer a minor irritation. It was a growing threat backed by Russia. And in Belgrade, flush with victory, nationalists spoke openly of liberating Bosnia and creating a Greater Serbia. The stage was set for catastrophe. In Russia, the lesson of the Balkan Wars was clear: Slavic solidarity. St. Petersburg had mediated between the Balkan states during the wars, helping to form the alliance that destroyed Ottoman power. Russian public opinion demanded support for Serbia. To abandon the Serbs now would be political suicide for the Tsar. In Germany, the Kaiser watched nervously. Austria was Germany's only reliable ally, and the Habsburgs were growing weaker by the year. If Austria fell, Germany would be isolated. Berlin's policy became clear: support Austria unconditionally. Whatever Vienna decided, Germany would back it. This was the famous blank check, though it hadn't been issued yet. That would come in 1914. France and Britain watched the Balkans with unease, but assumed the crisis had passed. Grey's main concern was maintaining the balance of power. He didn't want Russia to dominate the Balkans, but neither could he allow Germany and Austria to crush Serbia. Britain would mediate, as it always had. Surely common sense would prevail. It was a reasonable assumption. After all, Europe had navigated countless crises over the past 40 years. Why should the next one be different? The answer lay in something no one fully appreciated. The alliance system had become rigid. Bismarck's flexible web of overlapping agreements had been replaced by two hostile blocs: Germany and Austria on one side, France and Russia on the other. Britain, uncomfortably in the middle, committed to France but not yet formally allied. This system had one fatal flaw. If any major power went to war, its ally would be dragged in automatically. A local conflict in the Balkans could escalate into a continental war within days. And in 1914, that's exactly what happened. The spring of 1914 was deceptively peaceful. In London, the social season was in full swing. Débutantes were presented at court, garden parties filled the calendars of the wealthy, and Parliament debated Irish Home Rule with its usual mixture of passion and tedium. Few gave much thought to foreign affairs. In Paris, the Caillaux affair dominated the headlines. The wife of the former Prime Minister had shot and killed a newspaper editor who'd been publishing her husband's love letters. The trial was a sensation. European diplomacy seemed far less interesting than Parisian scandal. In Berlin, the Kaiser was preoccupied with naval reviews and theatrical productions. He'd recently become obsessed with a plan to build a massive new palace. War seemed unlikely. After all, Germany's economy was booming. Trade with Britain and France had never been higher. Why risk all this progress? In St. Petersburg, the Romanov dynasty was celebrating its 300th anniversary. Grand ceremonies and parades marked the occasion. Nicholas genuinely believed the worst was behind him. The 1905 revolution was a distant memory. The economy was growing rapidly. Russia was recovering its strength. In Vienna, Franz Joseph went about his daily routine with the mechanical precision of 6 decades. Rise at 4 in the morning. Work at his desk until the afternoon. Receive ministers and ambassadors. The empire still functioned, though increasingly it felt like a museum piece. Europe in June 1914 looked stable. The great crises of the past decade had passed. Morocco was settled. The Balkans seemed quiet after the wars of 1912 and 13. The naval race was slowing down. Even the socialists, who'd long predicted a capitalist war, were beginning to think peace was permanent. Norman Angel's book, The Great Illusion, published in 1910, had become a bestseller. His argument was simple. Modern economies were so interconnected that war between major powers was economically irrational. The cost would exceed any possible gain. Therefore, war had become obsolete. It was a comforting theory, and in June 1914, many believed it. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The alliance system was rigid and inflexible. Germany's military plans assumed a quick war, defeat France in 6 weeks, then turn east against Russia. Speed was everything. Any delay would allow Russia to mobilize its massive army. This meant Germany couldn't afford a long diplomatic crisis. If war looked likely, the generals would demand immediate mobilization. And mobilization meant war, because the Schlieffen Plan couldn't be stopped once it started. Russia faced similar pressures. Its mobilization was slower than Germany's, taking weeks instead of days. This meant Russia had to mobilize first, or risk being overrun before its armies were ready. But Russian mobilization would trigger German mobilization, which would trigger French mobilization. The dominoes were lined up perfectly. France was trapped between its desire for peace and its commitment to Russia. Without Russia, France would face Germany alone, a terrifying prospect. But supporting Russia meant potentially being dragged into a war France didn't want. Britain's position was the most ambiguous. Grey had carefully avoided a formal alliance with France. He wanted to preserve Britain's freedom of action. But the military conversations meant British and French planning were deeply intertwined. If Germany attacked France, Britain would face enormous pressure to intervene. And Austria, poor, declining Austria, faced an impossible choice. Serbia was growing stronger and more aggressive. The Black Hand was actively fomenting unrest in Bosnia. If Austria did nothing, the empire's credibility would collapse. But if Austria acted against Serbia, Russia would almost certainly intervene. And Russian intervention meant German involvement, which meant France, which might mean Britain. It was a system designed to preserve peace through deterrence. The theory was simple. If everyone knew that a local war would become a general war, no one would dare start one. But the system had a fatal flaw. It assumed rational decision-making in a crisis. It assumed leaders would have time to negotiate. It assumed everyone would choose peace over honor. It assumed no one would make a catastrophic miscalculation. On June 28, 1914, All those assumptions were tested. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie travelled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. It was their wedding anniversary. It was also Vidovdan, Serbian National Day, commemorating their defeat by the Ottomans in 1389. The date was insensitive. Security was lax. 6 young assassins waited along the motorcade route. They were members of the Black Hand, armed with bombs and pistols. Most were teenagers, sick with tuberculosis, expecting to die young anyway. They'd been trained and equipped by Serbian military intelligence. The first attempt failed. A bomb bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded under the next vehicle, wounding several officers. Franz Ferdinand continued to the town hall reception. He was furious but controlled. "One comes here for a visit and is received by bombs," he said with icy sarcasm. After the reception, he insisted on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital. The driver took a wrong turn down Franz Joseph Street. When he realized his mistake, he stopped the car to reverse. Directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, the 19-year-old assassin stepped forward and fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Sophie died almost instantly. Franz Ferdinand bled out minutes later, whispering, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." Europe had 4 weeks. 4 weeks of ultimatums, misunderstandings, and miscalculations. 4 weeks as the alliance system transformed a Balkan assassination into a continental catastrophe. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Europe was at war. The long peace was over. And no one knew it yet, but the world they'd known was ending too.